They howled when he bid $1 for a frail Choctaw woman. No one dared laugh after she saved him. Redemption Creek, Arizona Territory. October 18, 1878. The autumn wind carried the scent of dust and desperation across the weathered planks of the town square, where hope went to die and dignity was sold to the highest bidder. The sun hung low and merciless over the makeshift auction platform, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward the gathering crowd like gnarled fingers. Men in worn boots and sweat-stained hats shuffled closer, their eyes hungry for whatever misfortune might offer them cheap labor or cheaper entertainment. Sheriff Tom Bradley climbed onto the platform, his badge catching the dying light as he unfolded a piece of paper with all the ceremony of a man reading last rites. The crowd quieted, sensing the familiar ritual about to begin. This was the monthly auction where the desperate, the destitute, and the damned were offered to anyone with coin enough to claim them. Gentlemen, Bradley's voice carried across the square like a funeral bell. We got ourselves a variety of folks today seeking honest work and fair treatment. First up, we got Samuel Jenkins, age 42, experienced with horses and cattle work. A weathered man stepped forward, his shoulders straight despite the circumstances that had brought him here. The bidding was quick and practical. 3. Ranchers needed hands, and Jenkins commanded a respectable price of $8 for a month's work. He disappeared into the crowd with his new employer. Another transaction completed. The auction continued with mechanical efficiency. A young Mexican woman skilled in cooking and cleaning brought $12 from Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house. 2 brothers from Ireland, fleeing potato famine and seeking any opportunity in the New World, were hired by the railroad company for track-laying work. But as the afternoon wore on and the acceptable candidates were claimed, the crowd's mood shifted. What remained on Sheriff Bradley's list were the cases that made decent folks uncomfortable. The broken, the foreign, the unwanted. The entertainment portion of the auction was about to begin. Next we have, Bradley paused, consulting his notes with visible reluctance. Halona Idish, age 26, member of the Choctaw Nation. Skilled in herbalism and traditional medicines. Physical condition is, somewhat compromised due to recent hardships. A murmur rippled through the crowd as a figure emerged from the shade of the jailhouse. The woman who stepped onto the platform bore little resemblance to the proud Choctaw people who had once commanded respect across the territories. Halona Idish was thin almost to the point of fragility, her traditional dress hanging loose on her diminished frame. Her long black hair, which should have gleamed like obsidian, was dull with dust and neglect, but her eyes burned with something the crowd couldn't quite identify. Not defeat, not submission, but a kind of watchful intelligence that made some of the men shift uncomfortably. She held herself with a dignity that seemed impossible given her circumstances, as if she were a queen temporarily displaced rather than a woman reduced to selling her labor. "What's wrong with her?" called out Pete Morrison, the town drunk. When he could afford it, unemployed when he couldn't. His question drew nervous laughter from the crowd. "Well," Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat, "she's been without proper food for some time. Came to us after her people were relocated. She's alone now, no family, no tribe to speak for her. But she claims knowledge of healing herbs and such, Injun medicine," scoffed Jake Williams, whose farm had failed twice due to his own laziness rather than any act of God. "Probably witchcraft and nonsense. What use is that to decent folks?" The laughter that followed was sharp and ugly, the kind that revealed more about the crowd than about its target. Halona's expression never changed, but her hands clenched slightly at her sides. "She looks like a strong wind might blow her to Mexico," jeered another voice. "How's she supposed to work a full day when she can barely stand upright?" Sheriff Bradley raised his hand for quiet, though he seemed no more enthusiastic about the proceedings than his audience. "Look, folks, the law says we got to offer everyone a fair chance. Starting bid is set at 50 cents for a month's work, Any takers? Silence stretched across the square like a held breath. 50 cents was already insulting, less than a man might spend on whiskey in a single evening. But apparently, even 50 cents was too much to risk on what the crowd saw as damaged goods. 25 cents, called out Jim Morton, the owner of the town's most disreputable saloon. His offer drew snickers from the crowd, who knew Morton's reputation with women and his particular fondness for those who couldn't fight back. Figure she might be able to sweep floors and empty spittoons. If she don't collapse first. 30 cents, countered Bill Hayworth, not out of kindness but because he enjoyed outbidding Morton on principle. Got some washing that needs doing. Indian girl might know how to work hard, even if she don't look like much. The bidding continued in this vein. Small increases motivated more by spite than by any genuine need for Halona's services. The crowd was enjoying itself now, treating the auction like a sporting event where the prize was human dignity. Through it all, Halona stood motionless on the platform, her gaze fixed on some point beyond the crowd, as if she could see something they could not. 75 cents. Morton called out, his voice thick with implications that made several of the married women in the crowd look away. Final offer. Take it or leave it. Bradley looked around the square, hoping someone might object to Morton's obvious intentions, but the crowd had gone quiet. 75 cents for a month's labor, from a woman who would have no protection, no recourse, no hope of escape from whatever treatment Morton chose to provide. Any other bids? Bradley asked, though his heart wasn't in it. He'd seen this pattern before, seen decent people turned into commodities by circumstances beyond their control. But the law was the law, and Morton's money was as good as anyone's. $1. The voice cut through the murmur of the crowd like a blade through silk. Every head turned toward the back of the square, where a figure had stepped forward from the shadows of the general store. Marcus Dutch van der Berk stood 6 feet and 3 inches in his worn boots, his broad shoulders filling out a coat that had seen better days but was still respectable. His blonde hair was streaked with premature gray, and his blue eyes held the kind of cold assessment that came from years of making life and death decisions in seconds. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from Gettysburg that he wore like a badge of neither honor nor shame. Dutch had been leaning against the store's wooden support post for the better part of an hour, watching the proceedings, with the detached interest of a man who had seen enough of human nature to expect little good from it. He'd come to town for supplies, salt, coffee, ammunition, the basics that kept a man alive in the wilderness. He had not come to participate in what amounted to a slave auction, but something about the woman on the platform had caught his attention. Maybe it was the way she refused to let her circumstances break her spirit. Maybe it was the recognition of someone else who had lost everything but somehow continued to stand upright. Or maybe it was simply that Dutch van der Berk had reached the point in his life where he could no longer watch injustice pass by without taking action. $1, he repeated, stepping fully into the light. The crowd parted before him like water before the prow of a ship. Dutch had that effect on people, not because he was the biggest man in any room, though he was usually close, but because he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced death and found it wanting. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered someone in the crowd. "That's Dutch van der Berk. Heard he was dead. Heard he killed half the Confederate army single-handed," whispered another voice. "Heard he's been living up in the mountains like a wild man since the war ended." The whispers followed Dutch as he approached the platform, but he paid them no attention. His focus was entirely on the woman standing above him, and for the first time since she'd stepped into view, Halona Idish looked directly at one of her potential purchasers. Their eyes met across the dusty space, and something passed between them that the crowd couldn't see but somehow sensed. It wasn't romance. Both of them were too battered by life for such simple emotions. It was recognition, the kind that occurs when two people who have survived the unsurvivable acknowledge each other's strength. Mr. Van der Berk, Sheriff Bradley said carefully. Everyone in 3 counties knew Dutch's reputation, and Bradley had no desire to cross a man who had reportedly once held off an entire Apache war party with nothing but a rifle and sheer stubborn refusal to die. "You're bidding $1 for the woman's services?" "I am," Dutch replied. His voice was quiet but carried easily across the square. He spoke with the slight accent that revealed his Dutch immigrant parents, though he'd been born on American soil and bled on American battlefields. Morton stepped forward, his face flushed with alcohol and anger. "Now hold on there, Van der Berk. I had the high bid at 75 cents. You can't just come in here and—" $1, Dutch interrupted, his voice never changing tone or volume. But something in his eyes made Morton take an involuntary step backward. "That beats 75 cents where I come from. Unless mathematics work differently in saloons than they do in the real world." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, but no one was really laughing. They all knew Morton's reputation, but they also knew Dutch's. The difference was that Morton's reputation was built on preying on the weak, while Dutch's was built on protecting them. "Any other bids?" Bradley asked, though he was clearly hoping the answer would be no. The tension in the square was thick enough to cut with a knife. $50, Morton snarled, though his voice lacked conviction. He was posturing now, trying to save face. In front of the crowd, Dutch reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a leather wallet that had seen as much wear as its owner. He counted out bills with deliberate slowness, making sure everyone could see exactly how much money he carried. The message was clear. He could outbid Morton until the sun set and the moon rose. $5, Dutch said quietly. The crowd gasped. $5 was more than most of these men made in a week. It was more than anyone had ever paid at one of these auctions, more than Halona Idish was worth by any practical measurement. But Dutch Van der Berk had never been a practical man. Morton's face went through several interesting color changes before settling on a shade of purple that suggested either apoplexy or acute embarrassment. $5 for that scarecrow? You gone soft in the head, Dutch? She ain't worth 5 cents, let alone $5. Then I reckon you won't be bidding any higher, Dutch replied. He folded his wallet and returned it to his pocket with the same deliberate care he'd used to remove it. Sheriff Bradley looked around the square one final time, but no one else seemed inclined to challenge Dutch Van der Berk's bid. Morton was still sputtering, but his protests had more to do with wounded pride than any real intention to continue bidding. "Sold to Mr. Van der Berk for $5, Bradley announced, relief evident in his voice. "Ma'am, you can step down." Now, Halona Idish descended from the platform with careful dignity, each step measured and controlled despite her obvious weakness. She approached Dutch with her head held high, meeting his gaze directly. When she reached him, she stopped and waited, saying nothing. Dutch pulled out his wallet again and counted $5 into Sheriff Bradley's waiting palm. The transaction was completed with the same efficiency as all the others, but somehow it felt different. The crowd sensed it too. This wasn't just another desperate person being claimed by whoever could afford them. This was something else entirely. "What's your name?" Dutch asked quietly, though he'd heard it during the bidding. "Halona Idish," she replied. Her voice was soft but clear, carrying the musical cadence of her native language beneath the English words. "I'm Marcus Van der Berk. Most folks call me Dutch," he said. "You got belongings you need to collect?" She shook her head. "What?" "I own, I carry," Dutch nodded, understanding the implications. Everything she'd once possessed, family, home, the accumulated treasures of a lifetime, had been lost in the great displacement of her people. What stood before him was all that remained. "My wagon's at the livery stable," he said. "We can be on our way whenever you're ready." As they turned to leave, the crowd began to disperse, but the whispers followed them down the street. The general consensus seemed to be that Dutch Van der Berk had finally cracked under the pressure of his solitary life. that he'd wasted good money on damaged goods that would probably die before winter ended. But as Dutch and Helona walked side by side toward the livery stable, neither of them looked back. They had both learned that the opinions of small-minded people mattered less than the courage to do what felt right, regardless of the consequences. The sun was setting by the time Dutch finished loading his supplies into the wagon. Helona sat quietly on the wooden seat, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She hadn't asked where they were going, hadn't questioned his motives, hadn't demanded explanations or assurances. She simply waited with the patience of someone who had learned that survival sometimes required trust in strangers. Dutch climbed up beside her and took the reins. The horses were restless, eager to return to familiar territory after a day in town. As they rolled out of Redemption Creek, Dutch found himself wondering what he'd gotten himself into. He'd acted on impulse, something he'd trained himself not to do during years of military service. But something about Helona Idish had triggered instincts he'd thought were dead. "Where are we going?" she asked as the town fell away behind them. "My ranch," Dutch replied. "About 15 miles north of here. Nothing fancy, but it's got solid walls and a good well. You'll have your own room, your own space. I'm not expecting anything from you except maybe some help around the place when you're feeling stronger." Helona nodded but said nothing. Dutch understood her caution. She had no reason to trust him, no way of knowing whether he was an improvement over Morton or simply a different kind of threat. Time would tell, he supposed. Time always did as they rode through the gathering. Darkness, neither of them spoke. But Dutch found himself oddly comforted by her presence. For too long, his world had been populated only by ghosts and regrets. Having another living soul nearby, even one as mysterious as Helona Idish, felt like a small miracle behind them. Redemption Creek settled into its evening routine of drinking, gambling, and the kind of small cruelties that flourished in places where civilization wore thin. Ahead lay the wilderness that Dutch had made his home, a place where a man could disappear from the world and a woman might find space to heal. The wagon wheels turned steadily through the night, carrying two broken souls toward an uncertain future. Neither of them knew that within a matter of weeks, their lives would become so intertwined that the town of Redemption Creek would have an entirely different story to tell about the frail Choctaw woman and the man who bid $1 for her freedom. The Vanderberg Ranch sprawled across a valley that time seemed to have forgotten, nestled between towering red cliffs and a meandering creek that sang softly through cottonwood groves. Dawn broke over the horizon like molten copper, painting the adobe walls of the main house in shades of gold and crimson. Dutch had built this place with his own hands after the war, each stone and timber chosen with the deliberate care of a man who understood that some wounds could only heal in solitude. Helona stood on the wooden porch, wrapped in a blanket. Dutch had given her the night before, watching the sun climb over the eastern ridge. She had slept fitfully in the small room he'd prepared for her, her body unaccustomed to the luxury of a real bed after months of sleeping on hard ground or in jail cells. The room was simple but clean, with whitewashed walls, a narrow window that faced the mountains, and a washstand with a mirror that reflected a face she barely recognized as her own. Dutch emerged from the barn, leading a chestnut mare, his movements economical and purposeful in the way of men who had learned to waste neither motion nor energy. He'd been up since before dawn, tending to the animals and checking the property for signs of trouble. The war had taught him many lessons, but perhaps the most important was that safety was an illusion that required constant vigilance to maintain. "Morning," he said quietly as he approached the house. Helona turned at the sound of his voice, and Dutch found himself studying her face in the clear morning light. Yesterday's auction seemed like something from another lifetime, though barely 12 hours had passed. Here, away from the cruel laughter and calculating eyes of Redemption Creek, she looked different. Still fragile, still marked by hardship, but somehow more substantial, as if the simple act of being treated with dignity had begun to restore something essential that had been nearly lost. "Good morning," she replied. Her voice carried better in the clean air, no longer competing with the jeers and whispers of a hostile crowd. "Thank you for the room." "I slept well," Dutch nodded, studying her with the same careful attention he might give to an injured animal. He was trying to help. "You look better. Color's coming back to your cheeks. You hungry?" The question was simple, but it carried weight that both of them understood. When had she last eaten a proper meal? When had anyone cared whether she was hungry? The answers to those questions were written in the sharp angles of her face, the way her dress hung loose on her diminished frame. "I am," she admitted. "But I can cook for myself. I don't want to be a burden." "No burden," Dutch said firmly. "Got plenty of food, and I'm not much of a cook anyway. Usually just fry up some bacon and call it breakfast." "You can do better than that, I reckon." He led her to the kitchen, a comfortable room with a large stone fireplace, well-stocked shelves, and a table made from a single slab of pine. Halona's eyes widened slightly as she took in the abundance. Sacks of flour and cornmeal, jars of preserved vegetables, smoked meat hanging from the rafters. It was more food than she'd seen in one place since before her people were forced from their lands. "Help yourself to whatever you need," Dutch said. "I got to check the fence line in the north pasture. Should be back by noon." After he left, Halona stood alone in the kitchen, overwhelmed by the sudden freedom to choose what to eat, how much to take, when to prepare it. For months, her survival had depended on the charity of others, doled out in grudging portions with constant reminders of her dependence. Now she faced shelves full of provisions and the implicit trust that she would take only what she needed. She moved slowly through the kitchen, running her fingers along the smooth wooden counters, examining the well-maintained cookware, breathing in the scents of dried herbs and cured meat. This was a home, not just a shelter. It spoke of a man who valued comfort and order, who took pride in the space he had created, even if he lived in it alone. Halona prepared breakfast with the careful attention of someone rediscovering a forgotten art. Cornbread with honey, eggs from the chickens she could see scratching in the yard outside, bacon fried to the perfect balance of crispy and tender. As she worked, she found herself humming an old Choctaw song her grandmother had taught her, a melody that spoke of morning light and new beginnings. When Dutch returned at midday, he found the kitchen transformed. The simple meal was laid out on clean plates, the coffee was hot and strong, and the room carried the warm sense of home cooking. But more than that, Halona herself seemed transformed. The act of cooking, of creating something nourishing and beautiful, had brought light back to her eyes. "Smells incredible," Dutch said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. Been a long time since this kitchen saw cooking like this. They ate in comfortable silence, the food disappearing with the efficient appreciation of people who understood the value of a good meal. Dutch found himself stealing glances at Halona as she ate, noting the way she savored each bite, the careful gratitude with which she approached even this simple abundance. "This cornbread," Dutch said finally. "Never tasted anything like it. What did you do different?" "Wild sage," Halona replied, "and a touch of mesquite honey. My grandmother taught me that different places have different flavors. You have to listen to the land, taste what it offers." "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." Halona's expression grew distant. She was. She could make medicine from plants that other people saw as weeds. Could read the sky like a book, tell you what the weather would be 3 days ahead. She said the earth speaks to those who know how to listen. What happened to her? The question hung in the air between them. Dutch regretted asking it almost immediately, but Halona's voice remained steady when she answered. The removal. The long walk to Oklahoma Territory. She was old, and the journey was hard. She died 2 days before we reached the reservation. I buried her by a creek that had no name, in soil that would never know her footsteps again. Dutch set down his fork, his appetite suddenly gone. He'd heard stories about the Indian removals, the forced marshes that had displaced entire nations from their ancestral lands. But hearing it described by someone who had lived through it, who had held her grandmother's hand as she died in exile, made it real in a way that newspaper accounts never could. "I'm sorry," he said. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. "She taught me that even when everything is taken from you, knowledge remains. Skills remain. The ability to heal, to help, to make something good from whatever materials you have. That's why I survived when others didn't." After lunch, Halona began to explore the ranch with Dutch's permission. The property was larger than she'd realized, stretching across several thousand acres of varied terrain. There were pastures where cattle grazed peacefully, stands of pine and aspen that provided timber and shade, and hidden valleys where wildflowers bloomed in riotous profusion. But what drew her attention were the plants. Dutch's ranch was a living pharmacy, home to dozens of species that her grandmother had taught her to recognize and use. White sage for purification and healing, echinacea for boosting the body's defenses against illness, willow bark for pain relief, yarrow for wounds and bleeding. Plants that the white settlers dismissed as weeds, but that contained more healing power than most of the medicines available in town. She spent the afternoon cataloging what she found, her excitement growing with each discovery. This land was rich in natural remedies, a treasure trove of healing potential that was going completely unutilized. As she worked, she began to formulate plans, ideas for how these resources could be harvested and prepared to help both Dutch and others who might have need. That evening, she prepared a meal that showcased her growing understanding of the local ingredients. Trout from the creek, seasoned with wild herbs and cooked over coals. Vegetables from Dutch's garden, enhanced with foraged greens that added both flavor and nutrition. Bread made with acorn flour she'd prepared from nuts gathered near the creek. "This is remarkable," Dutch said as he tasted the fish. "I've been catching trout from that creek for 5 years, but they never tasted like this. Everything tastes better when it's prepared with understanding," Halona replied. "The fish, the herbs, the water they came from, they're all part of the same system. When you honor that connection, the food honors you in return." Over the following days, a routine began to develop between them. Dutch would handle the ranch's daily operations, checking on the cattle, maintaining fences and buildings, managing the practical aspects of survival in the wilderness. Halona would tend to the house, prepare meals that were both nourishing and delicious, and continue her exploration of the land's medicinal resources. But their arrangement was more than just a division of labor. Dutch found himself looking forward to returning to the house each evening, to the warm light in the windows and the sense of Halona's cooking. For too long, his ranch had been a place of solitude, a refuge from the world's cruelties, but also from its joys. Halona's presence brought life back to spaces that had grown cold with disuse. For her part, Halona began to understand that Dutch's gruff exterior concealed a man of surprising gentleness. He spoke little, but his actions revealed a deep well of consideration. He always ensured she had everything she needed before attending to his own comfort. He listened when she spoke about her grandmother's teachings, asked thoughtful questions that showed he valued her knowledge. Most importantly, he never made her feel like an obligation or a burden. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and gold, Halona finally asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. "Why did you bid for me at the auction?" Dutch was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost hesitant. "I suppose I recognize something. The way you stood up there, facing all those people who were treating you like an object to be bought and sold. You didn't break, didn't beg or plead or try to make yourself seem more valuable. You just stood there with dignity, waiting to see what would happen next." He paused, gathering his thoughts. I've seen a lot of people break under pressure, in the war, in the years since. But I've also seen a few who bend without breaking, who find a way to endure whatever the world throws at them.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Those are the people worth knowing, worth helping if you can, and worth paying $5 for. Dutch's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. Morton would have destroyed you. Maybe not all at once, but piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the woman I saw standing on that platform. $5 was a bargain to prevent that. Helona studied his profile in the fading light. This man who had appeared out of nowhere to change the course of her life. What about you? What brought you to this place, this life of solitude? The war, Dutch said simply. Gettysburg, specifically. I was a lieutenant in the Pennsylvania Volunteers. Saw things, did things that changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. When it was over, I found I couldn't go back to the life I'd had before. Too much noise, too many people, too many reminders of what we'd all lost. He gestured toward the ranch spread out before them. This place is far enough from everything that the ghosts can't find me. Most days anyway. Do you regret it? The isolation? Dutch considered the question seriously. I did for a while. But lately, I'm thinking maybe it was just preparation. Maybe I needed to learn how to be alone before I could learn how to be with someone else again. The conversation lingered between them as the stars appeared overhead, bright and clean in the high desert air. Neither of them spoke again, but something had shifted in their understanding of each other. They were no longer simply two damaged people thrown together by circumstance. They were beginning to become something more complicated, more hopeful. That night, as Helona lay in her narrow bed, listening to the sound of the creek and the distant call of coyotes, she found herself thinking about the future for the first time in months. Not just survival, not just making it through another day, but the possibility of building something meaningful in this place that Dutch had carved out of the wilderness. Outside her window, Dutch sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, unable to sleep. The ranch that had been his refuge for so long felt different now, charged with new possibilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries, new opportunities. To understand this remarkable woman who had appeared in his life like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was praying. The moon rose full and bright over the valley, casting silver light across the landscape. In the distance, an owl called to its mate, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled its wild song to the stars. The desert night was alive with the sounds of creatures going about their ancient business, following rhythms that predated human settlement by countless generations. Dutch and Helona, each lost in their own thoughts, were becoming part of those rhythms, learning to trust not just each other, but the possibility that two broken people might heal more completely together than either could manage alone. Tomorrow would test that possibility in ways neither of them could yet imagine. 3 weeks had passed since the auction in Redemption Creek, and the Vanderberg Ranch had settled into rhythms that felt almost like normalcy. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and the cottonwoods along the creek had begun their annual transformation from green to gold. Dutch found himself whistling as he worked, a habit he'd abandoned years ago, while Helona moved through her daily tasks with increasing confidence and strength, but the outside world had not forgotten about them. Word travels fast in small communities, and the story of Dutch Vanderberg's mysterious purchase had grown in the telling. Some versions painted him as a lonely hermit who'd finally cracked under the isolation. Others suggested darker motivations. Whispered speculation about what a man might want with an Indian woman bought at auction. The truth, as usual, was more complicated than the rumors, but truth rarely traveled as far or as fast as scandal. It was on a Tuesday morning, when frost still glittered on the grass and the air tasted like snow, that their peaceful routine was first disrupted. Dutch was in the barn, shoeing his bay gelding, when he heard the sound of approaching horses. Multiple riders, moving at a steady pace rather than the urgent gallop that might signal emergency or attack. He set down his hammer and moved to the barn door, his hand instinctively checking the Colt revolver at his hip. 4 men rode into the ranch yard, their horses steaming in the cold air. Dutch recognized the lead rider immediately, Captain James Morrison, his former commanding officer from the war, now serving as a territorial marshal. Morrison was a good man, honest and fair, but his presence here could only mean official business of some kind. "Dutch," Morrison called out, dismounting with the careful movements of a man who'd spent too many hours in the saddle. "Good too. See you looking well." "Been too long since Appomattox, Captain," Dutch replied, though Morrison now outranked that title. "What brings you to my corner of nowhere?" Morrison's expression grew serious. "Got some complaints filed in the territorial office. Folks in Redemption Creek seem to think he might be holding someone against their will. Indian woman, purchased at auction. They're claiming it's not legal, that the whole transaction was irregular." Dutch felt his jaw tighten. He'd expected curiosity, maybe even disapproval, but he hadn't anticipated legal challenges. The auction was conducted by Sheriff Bradley, witnessed by half the town. "I paid fair price for a month's labor, same as anyone else who bid. I know that," Morrison sighed. "But some folks are claiming the woman was coerced, that she couldn't legally enter into such an arrangement. Others are saying you're keeping her in conditions that amount to slavery. I don't believe it myself, but I'm obligated to investigate." From the house came the sound of a door opening, and Helona stepped onto the porch. She'd obviously heard the voices and come to investigate. In the 3 weeks since the auction, she'd gained weight and strength. Her face had filled out, and her hair gleamed with health. She wore a dress Dutch had bought for her on his last trip to town, deep blue wool that complemented her dark eyes. She looked nothing like the frail, desperate woman who'd stood on the auction platform. "Marshal Morrison," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I am Helona Idish. I believe you've come to inquire about my situation here." Morrison removed his hat, a gesture of respect that wasn't lost on Dutch. "Ma'am, I apologize for the intrusion, but I need to ask you some questions. Are you here of your own free will?" "I am," Helona replied without hesitation. "Mr. Van der Berk has treated me with nothing but kindness and respect. I have my own room, I'm well fed, and I'm free to leave whenever I choose. Have you been threatened or coerced in any way?" "The only threats I've received came from the men who bid against Mr. Van der Berk at the auction. He protected me from those threats by ensuring I wouldn't fall into their hands." Morrison nodded, making notes in a small leather journal. "The complainants also suggested that you might be afraid to speak truthfully in front of Mr. Van der Berk. Would you be willing to answer questions privately?" Helona's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger. "Marshal, I have survived the forced removal of my people from our ancestral lands. I have buried my family and walked hundreds of miles with nothing but the clothes on my back. I have been hungry, cold, and alone. But I have never been afraid to speak the truth. If you wish to question me privately, I will accommodate you, but it will not change my answers." The strength in her voice, the dignity with which she addressed the accusations seemed to settle something in Morrison's mind. Dutch could see his old commander's assessment shifting, the military man's ability to read character coming into play. "That won't be necessary, ma'am. I can see for myself that you're well cared for and free to speak your mind. But I do need to ask about the nature of your arrangement here. What exactly are your duties?" "I cook, I clean, I tend to the household needs," Helona said. "In return, I receive food, shelter, and protection. It's an honest arrangement, fairly made. And when the month's term is up..." Helona glanced at Dutch, and something passed between them that Morrison was sharp enough to notice. "We haven't discussed that yet. But I suspect we'll find an arrangement that suits us both. Morrison closed his journal and turned to Dutch. I'm satisfied that there's no coercion here, no illegal confinement. But Dutch, you need to understand the position this puts you in. There are people in Redemption Creek who want to make trouble for you, and they're using Miss Eidish as an excuse. What kind of trouble? The kind that involves federal marshals and territorial courts. The kind that asks questions about a white man living alone with an Indian woman, about the nature of their relationship, about whether such arrangements are proper according to territorial law. Dutch felt his temper beginning to rise. Since when is it illegal for a man to hire domestic help? Since that help is an Indian woman and the man is a known recluse with a reputation for violence, Morrison said bluntly. I'm not saying it's fair, Dutch. I'm saying it's reality. There are people who want to see you fail, who resent your independence and your refusal to conform to their idea of proper society. Who's behind the complaints? Morrison hesitated, then seemed to decide that honesty was the best policy. Jim Morton, for one. Claims you interfered with his legitimate bid, cost him property he'd rightfully won. Bill Hayworth's backing him up. Sheriff Bradley's trying to stay neutral, but he's getting pressure from the town council. Dutch wasn't surprised. Morton was exactly the kind of man who would hold a grudge, who would use official channels to pursue personal vendettas. What do you need from me to make this go away, honestly? Nothing you're not already doing. Keep treating Miss Eidish with respect. Make sure she's free to leave if she chooses, and try to avoid giving your enemies more ammunition. Maybe consider making your arrangement more formal, more obviously legitimate. After Morrison and his men left, Dutch and Halona stood in the ranch yard, watching the dust settle behind the departing horses. The morning's peaceful routine had been shattered, replaced by the stark reminder that their private arrangement existed within a larger world that might not approve of their choices. I'm sorry, Dutch said finally. I should have anticipated this. Should have realized that people would talk, would try to make trouble. You have nothing to apologize for, Halona replied firmly. You saved me from a situation that would have been far worse than anything we might face now. I'm not afraid of gossip or legal challenges. Maybe you should be. Morrison's right about one thing. There are people who want to see me fail. They'll use you to get to me if they can. Halona studied his face, reading the worry and self-doubt that he was trying to hide. Are you having second thoughts about helping me? No, Dutch said immediately. But I'm wondering if I'm helping you or just putting you in a different kind of danger. That afternoon, Halona made a decision that would change the trajectory of their relationship. She saddled Dutch's mare, something she'd learned to do by watching him, and rode into the hills behind the ranch. She'd been exploring these heights for weeks, cataloging the medicinal plants that grew in the rocky soil and thin air. But today she had a specific destination in mind. High on a ridge that overlooked the entire valley, she found what she was looking for, a grove of ancient pines that had somehow survived lightning strikes, forest fires, and the passage of centuries. These trees were sacred to her people, seen as guardians and witnesses to the long history of the land. Here, if anywhere, she might find the clarity she needed. She built a small fire, not for warmth but for ceremony, and began to burn sage and sweetgrass in the traditional way. As the fragrant smoke rose toward the sky, she offered prayers. For guidance, for strength, for the wisdom to see clearly what path lay ahead. Her grandmother had taught her that important decisions required more than just thinking. They required listening to the deeper voices that spoke in silence and solitude. The answers that came to her were not what she might have expected. She had been thinking of her relationship with Dutch in terms of safety and shelter, of practical arrangements and mutual benefit. But sitting in that sacred grove, with the wind singing through the pine needles and the vast landscape spread out below her, she began to understand that something much more significant was taking shape. She was falling in love with Dutch. Van der Berk. Not the desperate attachment of a rescued woman to her rescuer, but the deep recognition of a kindred spirit, someone whose wounds matched her own, whose strength complemented her weaknesses. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. When she returned to the ranch that evening, she found Dutch pacing the porch with barely contained worry. "Where were you?" he asked, relief evident in his voice. "I came back from checking. The cattle and you were gone. No note, no word about where you'd went. I needed to think," Halona said simply. "About what the marshal said, about what people are saying, about what we're doing here. And what did you decide?" Halona dismounted and walked to the porch, stopping just close enough that she could see the worry lines around Dutch's eyes, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "I decided that I don't care what they say about us in town. I decided that this place, this life we're building, is worth fighting for." Dutch stared at her, searching her face for something he couldn't quite name. "Halona, you need to understand what you're saying. If you stay here, if we continue this arrangement, people are going to assume things about our relationship. They're going to make it harder for both of us. Let them assume," Halona said. "Let them make it harder. I've survived worse things than gossip and legal challenges. The question is, do you want me to stay?" The question hung between them like a bridge that, once crossed, would change everything. Dutch looked at this woman who had somehow become essential to his daily existence, who had brought warmth and purpose back to a life he'd thought was permanently cold. The answer should have been complicated, should have required careful consideration of all the potential consequences. "Yes," he said simply. "I want you to stay." That night, they sat on the porch longer than usual, talking about practical matters that suddenly seemed charged with new meaning. How to formalize their arrangement to satisfy the territorial authorities. How to prepare for winter, which was coming faster than either of them had anticipated. How to deal with the inevitable attempts to drive them apart, but underneath the practical discussions was a current of deeper understanding. They were no longer two damaged people finding temporary shelter in each other's company. They were partners, allies, two halves of something that was becoming stronger than either of them could be alone. The moon rose full and bright over the valley, casting silver light across the landscape they both now considered home. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the sound seemed to echo the longing and hope that filled the space between them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of their resolve, but tonight they were together, and that was enough. As they finally prepared to go inside, Halona turned to Dutch with a question that had been weighing on her mind. "The marshal called you Dutch, but your name is Marcus. Why do people call you Dutch?" Dutch smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him all day. "My parents were from Holland, came to America when I was a baby. The other soldiers in my unit couldn't pronounce Van der Berk properly, so they started calling me Dutch. After a while it stuck. Do you prefer Marcus or Dutch?" "From you, Marcus. Dutch is what the world calls me. Marcus is who I am when I'm home." Halona nodded, understanding the distinction. "Good night, Marcus. Good night, Halona." As they parted at the top of the stairs, each heading to their respective rooms, both of them carried the weight of unspoken words, of feelings that were growing stronger with each passing day. The legal challenges and social pressures they faced were real and potentially dangerous, but they had found something worth defending, something worth fighting for, outside. The desert night settled into its ancient rhythms, and the land that had witnessed countless stories of love and loss, hope and despair, prepared to witness another chapter in the long history of two souls finding each other against all odds. November brought the first serious snowfall to the Van der Berk ranch, 3 feet of powder that transformed the valley into a pristine white wilderness. The cattle huddled in the sheltered draws, and Dutch worked from dawn to dusk, ensuring they had access to feed and unfrozen water. The isolation that had once been his refuge now carried new weight. As the mountain passes became impassable, and the ranch was effectively cut off from the outside world until spring. Halona had spent the autumn months preparing for winter. With the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that survival in harsh conditions required planning and foresight. She had dried herbs, preserved vegetables, smoked meat, and prepared enough medicinal remedies to last through the months of cold. The root cellar beneath the house was stocked with supplies, and the main room had been reorganized to maximize warmth and efficiency during the long dark season ahead. But it was during this period of enforced isolation that their relationship deepened in ways neither had anticipated. Confined to the house by blizzards that could last for days, they found themselves sharing stories, dreams, and fears with an intimacy that surprised them both. Dutch spoke of the war for the first time since it ended, describing battles and losses that had shaped him in ways he was still discovering. Halona shared memories of her grandmother's teachings, the rich cultural heritage that had been nearly destroyed but survived in the knowledge she carried. One evening, as wind howled around the house like a living thing seeking entry, Halona was grinding dried roots into medicinal powder when Dutch noticed her hands shaking. Not from cold, but from what appeared to be pain. "What's wrong?" he asked, setting down the harness he'd been mending. "Nothing serious," Halona replied, but Dutch could see the tight lines around her eyes, the careful way she was moving her fingers. "Old injury. Gets worse in cold weather. Let me see." Halona hesitated, then extended her hands toward the firelight. Dutch could see the faint scars across her knuckles, the slightly twisted angle of her left pinky finger, evidence of bones that had been broken and healed improperly. "What happened?" "Soldiers," Halona said simply. "During the removal, I tried to carry my grandmother's medicine bag with me. They said we couldn't take anything that wasn't essential for survival. When I refused to give it up, She flexed her fingers carefully, testing the range of motion. They made their point clearly. Dutch felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him through years of war. But this was different, more personal. The thought of someone deliberately hurting Halona, breaking the very hands that now created such beauty and healing, made him want to find those soldiers and teach them what real pain felt like. "Can you still work with them? Do the things you need to do?" "Most things," Halona said. "But on nights like this, when the cold settles deep, they remember what was done to them." Dutch disappeared into his bedroom and returned with a small jar of liniment he'd used on his own war injuries. "This might help. Camphor and wintergreen, mixed with bear grease. Got it from an old trapper who swore it could ease any ache." Halona accepted the jar gratefully, but when she tried to apply the liniment to her hands, the pain made her wince. Without thinking, Dutch reached out. "May I?" She nodded, and Dutch took her hands in his, applying the liniment with gentle pressure. His hands were large and calloused from years of hard work, but his touch was careful, almost reverent. As he worked the medicine into her scarred knuckles, both of them became acutely aware of the intimacy of the moment. "Better?" Dutch asked quietly. "Much better," Halona whispered. Their eyes met across the small space between them, and the air seemed to charge with possibility. For a moment, the wind outside faded to silence, the cold receded, and there was only the warmth of the fire and the connection growing between them. The moment was broken by a sound from outside that made Dutch's blood run cold. Not the wind, not the normal night sounds of the desert, but the unmistakable whinnying of distressed horses. Dutch grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, peering out into the swirling snow. "Someone's out there," he said grimly. "This weather, middle of the night, that means trouble. Could be travelers seeking shelter," Halona suggested. Though her voice carried doubt, travelers would come to the front door and call out proper. "This sounds like someone trying to approach without being seen." Dutch extinguished the lamps, plunging the room into darkness lit only by the dying fire. "Stay away from the windows," he told Halona. "If shooting starts, get down to the root cellar and don't come up until I call for you." I'm not hiding while you face danger alone. You're not hiding, you're being smart. I've got military training and experience with this kind of situation. You don't. The sound of horses grew closer, accompanied now by the muffled voices of multiple men. Dutch could count at least 4 distinct voices, maybe more. In the middle of a blizzard, at night, armed men approaching his isolated ranch could only mean one thing. This was a planned attack. Dutch van der Berk, a voice called from the darkness. We know you're in there. Come on out, and we can settle this peaceful like. Dutch recognized the voice immediately. Jim Morton, the saloon owner who'd been outbid at the auction. The man who'd made his intentions toward Halona clear enough that everyone present had understood what kind of life awaited her if Morton had been successful. What do you want, Morton? Dutch called back, positioning himself behind a heavy wooden table that would provide some protection from gunfire. Want to talk about that Indian woman you got in there? Been hearing stories about how you're treating her, and decent folks won't stand for it. Decent folks would wait for daylight and come to the front door like civilized people. Civilized? Morton's laugh was ugly, cutting through the wind. Ain't nothing civilized about a white man keeping an Indian woman like she was his personal property. We're here to set things right. Dutch knew there would be no reasoning with Morton and his companions. This wasn't about justice or morality. It was about wounded pride and the kind of racial hatred that had poisoned too much of the frontier. Morton had convinced himself and others that Dutch was somehow mistreating Halona, but Dutch suspected. The real motivation was simpler. Morton wanted what he'd been denied, and he'd found willing accomplices among the men who resented Dutch's independence and success. Last chance, van der Berk. Send the woman out and we'll consider letting you live. Dutch's response was to fire a shot over their heads, the sharp crack of his rifle cutting through the night air. Next one won't be a warning, he shouted. The answer came in a volley of gunfire that shattered the front windows and sent splinters flying from the wooden walls. Dutch returned fire, his shots precise and deliberate, aimed not to kill but to discourage. He could see muzzle flashes in the darkness, could track the movement of the attackers as they sought better positions. But as the gun battle intensified, Dutch realized he was in serious trouble. Morton had brought at least 6 men, possibly more, and they had positioned themselves to surround the house. Dutch had plenty of ammunition and good defensive positions, but he was outnumbered and couldn't watch all approaches simultaneously. It was then that Halona proved she had no intention of hiding in the root cellar. There's a ladder to the loft, she said, appearing at Dutch's elbow with his shotgun in her hands. I can cover the back approach from up there while you handle the front. Halona, no. It's too dangerous. More dangerous than letting them overrun us because you're trying to cover too much ground alone. Another volley of shots convinced Dutch that he couldn't afford pride or protectiveness. Do you know how to use that shotgun? My grandfather taught me to hunt before the soldiers came. Dutch nodded grimly. Loft window gives you a good view of the back pasture. Don't shoot unless they get within 50 yards of the house. Make every shot count. As Halona climbed to the loft, Dutch heard the sound of breaking glass from the kitchen. Morton's men were trying multiple approaches, testing the house's defenses. Dutch moved through the darkened rooms with the fluid efficiency of a soldier, appearing at windows just long enough to fire before shifting to a new position. From the loft came the deep boom of the shotgun, followed by a scream of pain from outside. Halona's voice called down. 2 men trying to come through the corral. One's down. The attack continued for what felt like hours, but was probably less than 30 minutes. Dutch and Halona worked together with a coordination that surprised them both, covering each other's positions, calling out targets and threats. But Dutch could hear the attackers regrouping, could sense them preparing for a final coordinated assault. That's when Halona proved that her grandmother's teachings had included more than just healing herbs. Marcus, she called from the loft, I need you to create a distraction at the front of the house. Something loud and visible. What are you planning? Trust me. Just keep them focused on the front for 2 minutes. Dutch didn't have time to question her plan. He gathered several pieces of burning wood from the fireplace and hurled them onto the front porch, creating a bright flare of light that drew immediate gunfire. While the attackers concentrated on the front of the house, Halona slipped out the back window of the loft and disappeared into the darkness. What happened next would become legend in 3 counties, though most people who heard the story never believed it. Halona had learned more from her grandmother than plant lore and cooking.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
She had learned the old skills of moving unseen, of reading terrain and weather, of using the land itself as a weapon. In the swirling snow and darkness, she became a ghost, circling around behind Morton's men with the silent efficiency of a practiced hunter. The first man never saw her coming. She struck him unconscious with the butt of a rifle she'd taken from Dutch's gun cabinet, then melted back into the darkness before his companions realized what had happened. The second man felt a sharp sting in his neck and collapsed within seconds, paralyzed by a dart tipped with a concentrated extract from a plant her grandmother had called sleep medicine. By the time Morton realized his force was being systematically eliminated by an invisible enemy, panic had begun to set in among his remaining men. They had come expecting to overwhelm a single defender, not to face a coordinated defense by 2 people who understood both modern warfare and ancient hunting techniques. Where is she? Morton screamed into the darkness. Where's the Indian? Which? His answer came from directly behind him as Halona emerged from the shadows with Dutch's Colt revolver pressed against the base of his skull. The Indian witch is right here, she said quietly. And she suggests you call off your attack before more of your men get hurt. Morton tried to turn, but Halona increased the pressure of the gun barrel. Don't move. Don't speak unless I ask you a question. Your friends are unconscious or paralyzed. The ones who can still walk have about 10 minutes to get them loaded up and off this property before the paralysis becomes permanent. Dutch appeared from the house, his rifle ready, and surveyed the scene with amazement. 6 men lay scattered around the ranch yard in various states of incapacitation, while Halona held their leader at gunpoint with the calm efficiency of a seasoned fighter. How did you ... Dutch began. Later, Halona said. Right now we need to decide what to do with Mr. Morton and his friends. Morton finally found his voice. You can't do this. We're lawmen conducting a legal investigation. Lawmen don't attack isolated ranches in the middle of blizzards, Dutch replied. Lawmen don't break windows and fire shots into occupied buildings. What you are is a gang of would-be murderers who bit off more than you could chew. In the end, they loaded the unconscious and paralyzed men into their own wagons and sent them back toward town with a warning. Any future attacks on the ranch would be met with deadly force. Morton, humiliated and defeated, made threats about legal consequences and federal intervention, but his words carried no conviction. He'd lost this round decisively, and everyone present knew it. As dawn broke over the snow-covered valley, Dutch and Halona stood in the wreckage of their kitchen, surveying the damage. Broken windows, bullet holes in the walls, furniture overturned in the struggle. But they were alive, they were together, and they had proven something important to themselves, and to anyone who might challenge them in the future. Where did you learn to fight like that? Dutch asked as they began the cleanup. My people were warriors long before they were farmers, Halona replied. My grandmother taught me that a woman must know how to protect herself and those she loves. I never thought I'd need those skills, but I'm grateful to have them, those she loves? Dutch repeated quietly. Halona paused in her sweeping, suddenly aware of what she'd revealed. Yes, she said simply. Those she loves. Dutch crossed the room and took the broom from her hands, setting it aside. Halona, after what happened tonight, after seeing what we can do together, I need to say something I've been afraid to say. I love you too. "Marcus," she said, saving him the struggle of finding the words. "I've known it for weeks, but I was afraid to complicate what we had." "Complicated seems to be our specialty," Dutch said, pulling her into his arms. "But if you're willing to face whatever comes next, I'd like to ask you properly." "Ask me what?" "To be my wife. To make this partnership permanent, legal, and unbreakable." Helona looked into the eyes of the man who had saved her from degradation, who had given her a home and purpose, who had stood beside her in battle and proven himself worthy of her trust and love. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." Outside, the storm was beginning to clear, and the first rays of sunlight painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and silver. Inside the damaged but still standing ranch house, two people who had been broken by life had found wholeness in each other, and the future suddenly seemed bright with possibility. The weeks following the attack brought unexpected changes to their isolated valley. Word of the failed assault spread through the territory like wildfire, but the story that emerged bore little resemblance to the truth. In some versions, Dutch van der Berk had single-handedly fought off 20 armed men. In others, the mysterious Indian woman had used dark magic to defeat her attackers. The reality that two people had simply worked together with courage and intelligence was apparently too mundane for frontier storytelling. More importantly, Marshal Morrison returned to the ranch in early December, bringing with him a territorial judge and a small contingent of federal troops. The official investigation into Morton's attack had uncovered a web of corruption that extended far beyond one man's wounded pride. "Morton's been running an illegal operation for months," Morrison explained as they sat around the repaired kitchen table, using his position to extort money from local businesses, threatening anyone who opposed him. "The attack on your ranch was just the latest in a pattern of criminal behavior." Judge Harrison, a distinguished man with silver hair and keen eyes, had listened carefully to both Dutch and Helona's accounts of the events. "Mr. van der Berk, Miss Eidish, I want to personally apologize for the harassment you've endured. The territorial government does not condone vigilante justice, and those responsible will face the full consequences of their actions." "What about the accusations they made about our arrangement?" Dutch asked. "The claims that I was holding Miss Eidish against her will? Completely baseless," the judge replied firmly. "I've spoken with Miss Eidish privately, and it's clear that she's here by choice, that she's well treated, and that your arrangement is entirely legitimate. In fact, I'd like to discuss making that arrangement even more official." Helona and Dutch exchanged glances. They had spoken privately about marriage several times since the night of the attack, but had agreed to wait until the legal complications were resolved before making any formal announcements. "Judge Harrison," Helona said carefully, "Mr. van der Berk has asked me to marry him, and I've accepted. We were planning to travel to Redemption Creek for the ceremony once the weather cleared." The judge smiled broadly. "That won't be necessary. As a territorial judge, I'm authorized to perform marriages anywhere within my jurisdiction. If you're both certain of your decision, I'd be honored to conduct the ceremony right here." The wedding took place 3 days later, on a crisp December morning, when the snow sparkled like diamonds in the clear air. Marshal Morrison served as Dutch's best man, while the judge's wife, who had accompanied him from the territorial capital, stood with Helona. It was a small ceremony, simple and heartfelt, conducted in the main room of the ranch house with the smell of pine logs burning in the fireplace and the sound of wind singing through the eaves. "Do you, Marcus van der Berk, take Helona Eidish to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Dutch said, his voice steady and sure. "Do you, Helona Eidish, take Marcus van der Berk to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Helona replied, her eyes bright with tears of joy. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Marcus, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, almost tentative, as if both of them were still amazed by the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the frail woman on an auction platform to the strong partner who had fought beside him. From the lonely rancher to the man who had found love in the most unexpected place. The small wedding party celebrated with a feast that showcased Halona's remarkable cooking skills. Wild turkey that Dutch had shot in the hills, vegetables from the root cellar, bread made with flour ground from acorns and pine nuts, and a cake that somehow managed to be both elegant and rustic. Judge Harrison pronounced it the finest meal he'd eaten, years of traveling the territory. As the sun set on their wedding day, Dutch and Halona stood on the porch of their home, watching the last light fade from the western sky. The guests had departed, the dishes were cleaned and put away, and they were finally alone as husband and wife. "Do you have any regrets?" Dutch asked quietly. "About choosing this life, this place, this man who's more comfortable with cattle than with people?" Halona leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him, the warmth that had nothing to do with the thick coat he wore. "My only regret is that my grandmother isn't here to meet you. She would have liked you, Marcus. She would have said you have a good spirit, a strong heart. What would she have thought about us? A Choctaw woman marrying a Dutch immigrant. She would have said that love recognizes no boundaries except those we create for ourselves. That two people who choose to build something together are honoring the best parts of both their traditions." The winter months that followed were the happiest either of them had ever known. Confined by snow and cold to the ranch in each other's company, they discovered the deep satisfaction of a partnership built on mutual respect, shared work, and genuine affection. Dutch taught Halona to shoot with rifle and pistol, skills that might prove necessary in their isolated location. Halona taught Dutch the medicinal properties of dozens of plants, knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death when the nearest doctor was days away. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to navigate the complex dynamics of marriage between two people who had been independent for so long. There were disagreements, moments of tension when their different backgrounds led to misunderstandings. Dutch's military training had taught him to make quick decisions and expect them to be followed without question. Halona's cultural tradition emphasized consensus and discussion before taking action. They learned to compromise, to communicate, to appreciate their differences as strengths rather than obstacles. Dutch discovered that Halona's careful deliberation often prevented mistakes that his quick decisions might have caused. Halona found that Dutch's ability to act decisively in crisis situations complemented her own more thoughtful approach to problem solving. As winter gradually gave way to spring, they began making plans for the future that went beyond simple survival. The ranch was profitable but could be more so with careful expansion. Halona's knowledge of medicinal plants suggested the possibility of developing a secondary income source that would provide security against the uncertainties of cattle ranching. Dutch's military connections might open opportunities for government contracts supplying beef to army posts throughout the territory. "We could build something here that lasts," Dutch said one evening as they worked together in the garden, preparing soil for spring planting. "Something bigger than just a ranch or just a business. A legacy." "What kind of legacy?" Halona asked, though she suspected she knew what he was thinking. "Children," Dutch said simply. "A family. People who could carry on what we've started here, who could prove that different cultures can come together to create something stronger than either could achieve alone." Halona smiled, her hands still busy with the soil but her heart full of possibilities. "I think that sounds like exactly the kind of legacy my grandmother would have approved of." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, but this time there was no alarm, no rush for weapons. The riders approached openly in broad daylight, calling out greetings as they came. It was a supply wagon from town, bringing mail and goods they had ordered months earlier. Among the letters was one that would change everything once again. An official communication from the Bureau of Indian Affairs informing Halona that the federal government was establishing a new policy regarding displaced tribal members. Those who had successfully integrated into territorial society could apply for full citizenship, with all the rights and protections that status provided. What does this mean? Dutch asked as they read the letter together. It means I could become a legal citizen of the United States, Halona said slowly. It means our marriage would be recognized by federal law, not just territorial law. It means our children would have the same rights as any other American children. The application process would be complex, requiring testimony from territorial officials, proof of successful integration, and a formal hearing before a federal judge. But Judge Harrison had already indicated his willingness to support their case, and Marshal Morrison had offered to provide whatever documentation might be needed. As spring arrived in full glory, painting the valley in every shade of green imaginable, Dutch and Halona van der Berg stood on the threshold of a future neither could have imagined when they first met at a dusty auction in Redemption Creek. They had found love, built a home, survived attacks both legal and physical, and were now preparing to claim their place as full participants in the American experiment. The transformation was remarkable when viewed from any angle. The frail, desperate woman who had stood on an auction platform had become a confident, capable partner who could hold her own in any situation. The isolated, bitter veteran had rediscovered his capacity for love, trust, and hope. Together, they had created something that was stronger than the sum of its parts. But their greatest test still lay ahead, in a crisis that would threaten not just their happiness, but their very lives, and would require every skill they had learned, every bond they had forged. To survive, spring arrived early in the Arizona territory that year, bringing with it an unexpected visitor that would test everything Dutch and Halona had built together. Dr. Samuel Whitmore rode into their valley on a lathered horse, his medical bag clutched tight against his chest and desperation written across his weathered face. Behind him, 3 days hard riding from the territorial capital, lay a crisis that threatened to become a catastrophe. Mrs. van der Berg, he called out as he dismounted near the ranch house. The formal address still sounded strange to Halona's ears, though she'd been legally married for 4 months now. I need your help. There's an outbreak in Phoenix, something we've never seen before. People are dying, and we don't know how to stop it. Dutch emerged from the barn where he'd been birthing a calf, his hands still bloody from the delivery. Doc Whitmore? What brings you all the way out here in such a hurry? Dr. Whitmore was a man Halona had met only once, during their wedding when he'd served as the territorial health inspector required for her citizenship application. He was known throughout Arizona as a skilled physician and a fair man, someone who treated Indian and white patients with equal care. His presence here meant something serious indeed. It started 3 weeks ago, Dr. Whitmore explained as they gathered in the kitchen. First case was a freight wagon driver who'd come up from Mexico. High fever, delirium, a rash that spread across his entire body. We thought it was smallpox at first, but the symptoms didn't match exactly. Then more cases appeared, spreading faster than anything I've seen. Halona poured coffee with steady hands, but Dutch could see the concern in her eyes. Disease was every frontier community's nightmare, spreading quickly through populations that had no immunity to exotic illnesses. How many dead? Dutch asked bluntly. 47 as of when I left Phoenix. But that was 3 days ago. By now it could be twice that number. The territorial governor has ordered a quarantine, but people are panicking. Some are fleeing the city, which means they could be spreading the disease to every town between here and California. What do you need from us? Halona asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Your grandmother's knowledge, Dr. Whitmore said directly. I've heard stories about traditional Choctaw medicine, about remedies that can treat conditions we don't understand. I've exhausted every treatment in my medical education, tried everything in my pharmaceutical supplies. Nothing works. People keep dying, and I'm running out of options. Halona was quiet for a long moment, her mind racing through everything her grandmother had taught her about fevers, rashes, and mysterious illnesses. The old woman had often spoken of diseases that came from far away, brought by traders and travelers, and the plant medicines that could sometimes halt their spread. "Describe the rash," she said finally. "Its color, its pattern, how it progresses." Across the body, Dr. Whitmore provided a detailed clinical description that would have done credit to any medical school textbook. As he spoke, Halona's expression grew more thoughtful, more certain. "Spotted fever," she said when he finished. "Not the Rocky Mountain variety, but something similar that my grandmother called trader's death. She said it came from the south. Carried by fleas and ticks, spread by poor sanitation and crowded conditions. Do you know how to treat it?" "Possibly. There's a combination of herbs that can reduce the fever and help the body fight the infection. But some of the plants I need don't grow in this valley. I'd have to travel south into the desert where the climate is different." Dutch felt his stomach tighten. The idea of Halona venturing into potentially hostile territory, seeking medicinal plants while a deadly epidemic raged, went against every protective instinct he possessed. "How far south?" he asked. "Maybe 50 miles. There's a canyon system near the Mexican border where certain cacti grow, plants that contain compounds my grandmother used for this exact type of fever. But it's dangerous country, full of bandits and Apache war parties. Then I'm going with you. Marcus, you can't. The ranch needs tending, the cattle need attention. And if I'm wrong, if this remedy doesn't work, you'll have exposed yourself to unnecessary risk for nothing." Dr. Whitmore looked between them, understanding the dynamics at play. "There might be another option. I could provide an escort, territorial soldiers who could ensure Mrs. Vanderberg's safety while she gathers what she needs." "No," Halona said firmly. "Soldiers make noise, create attention, scare away the very people who might help me locate the rarest plants. This kind of medicine gathering requires stealth and patience, not military force." Dutch studied his wife's face, reading the determination there, the sense of duty that drove her to risk herself for strangers she'd never met. It was one of the things he loved most about her, and one of the things that terrified him most. "If you're going, I'm going with you," he said finally. "Doc, can you spare a few days to help with the ranch while we're gone?" "Of course. But time is critical. Every day we delay means more deaths in Phoenix." They departed at dawn the next morning, riding south through terrain that grew progressively more hostile with each mile. Dutch had loaded a pack horse with supplies for a week in the desert, while Halona carried her grandmother's medicine bag and a collection of tools for harvesting and preparing plant specimens. The journey would take them through some of the most dangerous country in the territory, but they had little choice. The first day's travel was uneventful, following established trails through grazing land that looked much like their own valley. But as they climbed into the high desert, the landscape changed dramatically. Red rock formations thrust skyward like the spines of sleeping giants, and the vegetation became sparse and exotic. This was ancient land, shaped by forces that predated human civilization by millions of years. "There," Halona said on the second afternoon, pointing toward a deep canyon that cut through the desert floor like a wound in the earth. "That's where we need to go. The plants I'm seeking grow only in protected spaces like that, where underground water creates microclimates." The descent into the canyon was treacherous, requiring them to lead their horses along narrow ledges and rocky switchbacks. But once they reached the canyon floor, Dutch understood why Halona had been so specific about this location. Hidden springs fed pools of clear water, and the canyon walls provided shelter that allowed unusual plants to flourish. "Incredible," Dutch murmured, looking around at vegetation he'd never seen before. Barrel cacti the size of houses, flowering vines that seemed to grow straight from solid rock. Trees whose bark looked like it belonged in a tropical jungle rather than the Arizona desert. Halona moved through this botanical wonderland with the focused intensity of a surgeon, examining plants with the careful attention her grandmother had taught her. She collected specimens methodically, explaining their properties and uses as she worked. "This one reduces inflammation," she said, carefully harvesting flowers from a spiky shrub. "Combined with the sap from that barrel cactus, it can help the body regulate temperature during high fevers." "And this?" Dutch asked, pointing to a vine with unusual purple berries. "Blood purifier. Helps the liver process toxins, supports the immune system's fight against infection. But it has to be prepared exactly right, or it becomes poisonous instead of helpful." They worked through the afternoon, filling several large bags with carefully selected plant materials. Halona's knowledge seemed almost supernatural to Dutch, who watched her identify plants by their scent, their leaf patterns, even the sound they made when the wind moved through them. It was as they were preparing to make camp for the night that they encountered the complication Dutch had been dreading. The Apache warriors appeared as if they'd materialized from the canyon walls themselves. 6 men armed with rifles and painted for war. Their leader, a man with graying hair and scars that spoke of many battles, stepped forward with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You are trespassing on sacred ground," he said in heavily accented English. "This canyon belongs to the spirits, not to white settlers." Dutch's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Halona stepped forward, speaking in a language that surprised everyone present. "We come seeking medicine to heal the sick," she said, in fluent Apache, her words carrying the formal cadence of diplomatic speech. "My grandmother taught me the old ways, the knowledge that all tribes share about healing plants." The Apache leader studied her with new interest. "You speak our language well for a woman who travels with white men." "I am Choctaw," Halona replied. "My people and your people have fought common enemies, shared common struggles. We know that healing knowledge belongs to all who would use it wisely." What followed was a tense negotiation that lasted nearly an hour. The Apache had indeed considered the canyon sacred, but they were also aware of the epidemic spreading through the territory. Disease respected no boundaries, and what affected white settlements today might reach Indian communities tomorrow. In the end, the Apache leader, who introduced himself as Naish, son of Cochise, agreed to allow them to complete their plant gathering, but only after Halona demonstrated her knowledge by correctly identifying several sacred plants and explaining their ceremonial uses. "Your grandmother taught you well," Naish said as they prepared to part ways. "But the canyon spirits demand payment for what you take. When your medicine saves lives, remember that Apache knowledge contributed to that healing." The remainder of their plant gathering proceeded without incident, though Dutch remained nervous about the possibility of encountering Mexican bandits or additional Apache war parties. Halona worked with increased urgency, knowing that every hour they spent in the desert meant more deaths in Phoenix. On their return journey, they were forced to take shelter during a violent thunderstorm that turned dry washes into raging torrents and made travel impossible for nearly a day. Huddled in a cave with their horses and precious cargo, Halona began the delicate process of preparing her medicines. "The timing has to be perfect," she explained as she ground dried roots into powder. "Too little processing and the active compounds won't be available. Too much and they'll break down into useless or even harmful substances." Dutch watched his wife work by firelight, her hands moving with the precision of a master craftsman. The complexity of what she was doing was staggering, requiring knowledge that couldn't be learned from books or lectures, but had to be passed down through generations of careful teaching. "How do you know all this?" he asked. "How did your grandmother acquire such detailed knowledge about so many different plants?" "Trial and error over centuries," Halona replied without looking up from her work. "My people have been perfecting these medicines for longer than white doctors have been keeping written records." Every generation adds to the knowledge, tests new combinations, discovers new applications. And now you're the only one who knows. These particular remedies? Halona paused in her grinding, considering the weight of that responsibility. Not the only one, but one of very few. When my people were scattered, much of our medical knowledge was lost. Elders died before they could pass on everything they knew. Sacred plants became inaccessible when we were forced from our lands. The storm passed by morning, leaving the desert clean and sparkling under a brilliant blue sky. They rode hard for Phoenix, stopping only to rest their horses and allow Halona to complete the final stages of her medicine preparation. By the time they reached the territorial capital, she had created enough doses to treat 30 patients, though she warned that the remedy's effectiveness would depend on catching the disease in its early stages. Dr. Whitmore met them at the edge of the city, his face haggard from 3 days of fighting a losing battle against the epidemic. 68 dead now, he reported grimly. But I've got 20 patients in various stages of the disease who might benefit from whatever you've brought. What happened next would be talked about in medical circles for decades to come. Halona's traditional remedies, prepared according to centuries-old Choctaw methods, proved remarkably effective against the mysterious fever. Of the 20 patients treated with her medicines, 18 made full recoveries. The remaining 2, who had been near death when treatment began, showed significant improvement. The success was so dramatic that word spread rapidly throughout the territory. Newspaper reporters arrived from as far away as California to interview the Indian medicine woman whose traditional remedies had succeeded where modern medicine had failed. The territorial governor personally thanked Halona for her contribution to public health, but perhaps the most significant recognition came from an unexpected source. Dr. Whitmore, working with several colleagues from Eastern medical schools, published a detailed paper documenting Halona's treatment methods and their results. It was one of the first times traditional Indian medicine had been formally acknowledged by the American medical establishment. "You've done something remarkable here," Dr. Whitmore told them as they prepared to return to their ranch. "You've saved lives, certainly, but you've also opened doors. Medical schools are going to want to study your methods. Learn from your grandmother's knowledge. That knowledge was never meant to be hoarded," Halona replied. "If it can help people, if it can prevent unnecessary deaths, then it should be shared, but it must be shared with respect, with understanding of where it came from and what it represents." The journey back to their valley felt different somehow, charged with the awareness that their lives had changed in fundamental ways. Halona was no longer just the former auction woman who had married a reclusive rancher. She was a healer whose skills had been proven on the largest stage possible, a bridge between traditional knowledge and modern medicine. "What happens now?" Dutch asked as they rode through familiar territory, seeing their ranch buildings appear in the distance. "Now we go home," Halona said simply. "We tend our cattle, work our land, and continue building the life we started. But we do it knowing that the world is larger than this valley, and that sometimes the work we do here can affect people we'll never meet." As they crested the final hill before their ranch, both of them understood that they had passed another test, survived another crisis that had made them stronger as individuals and as a couple. The frail woman Dutch had bid $1 for at auction had become a healer, whose reputation would spread across the entire territory. The isolated rancher had become a partner in something larger than himself, but their greatest challenge still lay ahead, in a confrontation that would test not just their skills or courage, but the very foundations of their love and commitment to each other. 2 years had passed since the epidemic that made Halona Vander Berk famous throughout the Arizona territory. The ranch had prospered beyond Dutch's wildest dreams, expanding to include not just cattle, but a thriving medicinal herb business. Halona's reputation as a healer had brought patients from hundreds of miles away, seeking treatments that combined traditional Choctaw wisdom with modern medical understanding. The small adobe house had grown into a compound with separate buildings for Halona's medical practice and expanded living spaces for their growing family. Their son, Robert Nash van der Berk, was now 18 months old and showing signs of inheriting both parents' strong will and intelligence. But success had brought its own challenges. The more famous Halona became, the more attention their unusual family attracted from those who believed that racial mixing threatened the natural order of frontier society. Anonymous letters arrived regularly, filled with threats and condemnation. It was on a crisp October morning, exactly 3 years after their first meeting at the Redemption Creek auction, that their past finally caught up with them in the most dangerous way possible. Dutch was working in the north pasture when he heard the thunder of approaching horses. This wasn't the measured pace of visiting patients or supply wagons. This was the urgent gallop of riders who meant business, and not the friendly kind. He rode hard for the ranch house, his heart pounding with fear. As he crested the hill overlooking their home, he saw federal marshals surrounding the compound, their rifles drawn and ready. Marshal Morrison stood in the ranch yard, but his usual friendly demeanor was nowhere to be seen. His face was grim, official. Beside him stood a man Dutch didn't recognize, someone whose expensive suit and Eastern bearing marked him as a government official of significant rank. "Dutch," Morrison called as he approached. "Need you to dismount slow and easy. Keep your hands where we can see them. What's this about?" Dutch asked, though he was already beginning to suspect the answer. "Federal warrant," the stranger said, consulting an official-looking document. "I'm Deputy Attorney General Harrison Clark, here on direct orders from Washington. We're investigating allegations of fraud, conspiracy, and violations of federal law regarding the practice of medicine without proper licensing. Where is my wife?" Dutch asked. "Mrs. van der Berk is being questioned by my associates," Clark replied. "She's not under arrest at this time, but that could change depending on what our investigation reveals." Inside the house, Halona sat at her own kitchen table, facing 2 federal agents who had been questioning her for over an hour. Their approach was methodical, professional, and increasingly hostile. "Mrs. van der Berk," Agent Williams said, reviewing his notes, "you claim that your medical knowledge comes from traditional Choctaw teachings. But you have no formal education, no medical degree, no licensing from any recognized authority." "I have knowledge that has saved lives," Halona replied calmly. "Knowledge that your own Dr. Whitmore has publicly praised as effective and valuable. Knowledge that, according to federal law, constitutes the unlicensed practice of medicine. A felony offense that carries penalties, including imprisonment and substantial fines." The second agent leaned forward aggressively. "We also have questions about the circumstances of your marriage. Our investigation suggests that you may have been coerced into an arrangement that violates federal laws regarding involuntary servitude." Halona's eyes flashed with anger for the first time since the questioning began. "I was never coerced by my husband. He saved me from a situation where I would have been truly enslaved. Everything I've done since that day has been by my own choice." Outside, Dutch was having his own confrontation with Deputy Attorney General Clark, who seemed determined to find criminal behavior whether it existed or not. "Mr. van der Berk, our investigation has revealed a pattern of behavior that suggests deliberate fraud. You purchased an Indian woman at a public auction, then conspired with her to create an illegal medical practice. That's complete nonsense," Dutch replied. "My wife's medical practice is legitimate. She's saved dozens of lives with treatments that orthodox medicine couldn't provide." Clark paused, studying Dutch with the calculating gaze of a predator. "However, the federal government is prepared to be reasonable. If you cooperate with our investigation, if you agree to certain conditions, it's possible that the more serious charges could be reduced or even dismissed." "What kind of conditions?" "Your wife would cease all medical activities immediately. The medicinal herb business would be shut down. You would relocate to a different territory, away from the patients and supporters who have been misled by your fraudulent practices. Dutch stared at the federal agent, understanding now what this was really about. Someone in Washington had decided that Halona's success was dangerous, that allowing an Indian woman to gain recognition as a legitimate healer threatened established hierarchies, and if I refuse, then your wife will be arrested on federal charges that carry mandatory prison sentences. Your son will be placed in federal custody. Your ranch will be seized as the proceeds of illegal activity. It was then that Halona appeared in the doorway, having concluded her own interrogation. She walked with the same dignity Dutch remembered from that first day at the auction, her head high despite the circumstances. Behind her came little Robert, clinging to her skirt. "Mr. Clark," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard, "I understand you have questions about my medical practice. Mrs. van der Berg, you should be aware that anything you say can and will be used against you in federal court." "Then let me say this clearly, for the record," Halona replied. "I am a healer. I learned my skills from my grandmother, who learned them from her grandmother in an unbroken chain stretching back centuries. My knowledge has saved lives that orthodox medicine could not save. I am proud of what I do, and I will not apologize for it." Clark smiled coldly. "Mrs. van der Berg, you've just confessed to the unlicensed practice of medicine, a federal felony. Agent Williams, place her under arrest." But as Agent Williams stepped forward with handcuffs, a new voice interrupted the proceedings. "I don't think that will be necessary." Everyone turned to see a small convoy of riders approaching from the south. At their head rode Eleanor Roosevelt, now serving as a special advisor to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Behind her came Dr. Whitmore, Judge Harrison, and several other territorial officials. "Mrs. Roosevelt," Clark said, clearly caught off guard. "I wasn't aware that the Bureau of Indian Affairs had any interest in this case." "The Bureau has a great deal of interest in cases involving the persecution of Native Americans who have successfully integrated into territorial society," Eleanor replied crisply, "particularly when that persecution appears to be motivated by racial bias rather than legitimate law enforcement concerns." She dismounted and approached Halona with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Mrs. van der Berg, I've been following your work with great interest. Your success in treating the Phoenix epidemic has attracted attention at the highest levels of government." Dr. Whitmore stepped forward, carrying a leather portfolio filled with official documents. "Deputy Attorney General Clark, I have here sworn statements from 47 patients who were successfully treated by Mrs. van der Berg using traditional methods. I also have endorsements from 12 territorial physicians who consider her work both effective and ethical. Furthermore," Judge Harrison added, "I have documentation proving that Mrs. van der Berg's citizenship application has been approved by federal authorities, making her a full American citizen with all attendant rights and protections." Clark's confidence was beginning to waver as he realized his carefully planned operation was falling apart. "Mrs. Roosevelt, with all due respect, this is a federal law enforcement matter." "Actually," Eleanor replied, producing her own set of official documents, "Mrs. van der Berg's case has been designated as a test case for new federal policies regarding traditional medicine. Any prosecution would require approval from both the Attorney General and the Secretary of the Interior." The legal maneuvering continued for another hour, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Clark had come expecting to face an isolated couple with no powerful allies. Instead, he found himself confronting a coalition that included territorial officials, medical professionals, and federal authorities who saw Halona's success as beneficial to American society. In the end, all charges were dropped. The investigation was officially terminated. Clark and his agents departed with barely concealed frustration. As the dust settled and their supporters prepared to depart, Dutch and Halona stood in their ranch yard, holding their son between them, marveling at how close they had come to losing everything. How did you know to come? Dutch asked Eleanor Roosevelt. Dr. Whitmore sent word when he heard about the federal investigation. We've been watching your situation, knowing that someone would eventually try to use your success against you. Why does our success threaten them so much? Helena asked. Because you prove that their assumptions about racial superiority are wrong, Eleanor replied bluntly. You demonstrate that indigenous knowledge has value, that traditional cultures can contribute to American society. That's a dangerous idea to people who profit from maintaining existing hierarchies. After their visitors departed, Dutch and Helena walked through their property, seeing it with new eyes. The compound that had grown around their original adobe house, the medical clinic, the herb gardens, all of it represented something unprecedented in American history. Do you ever think about that day at the auction? Helena asked as they watched their son play in the yard. Every day, Dutch replied. I think about how close I came to walking away, to letting Morton win his bid. What made you step forward? What made you risk $5 on a woman everyone else saw as worthless? Dutch considered the question, as he had so many times over the past 3 years. I think I recognized something in you that I'd lost in myself. The refusal to be broken, even when everything else was gone. As the sun set over their valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Dutch and Helena van der Berg stood together on the porch of their home. 3 years earlier she had been a desperate woman standing on an auction platform, sold to the highest bidder for $1. Now she was a respected healer whose knowledge was saving lives across the American frontier. In Redemption Creek, the story was still told in saloons and general stores, though it bore little resemblance to the events that had actually transpired. Some versions claimed that Dutch van der Berg had possessed supernatural insight. Others suggested that Helena had used mystical powers to transform herself, but the truth was simpler and more profound than any legend. Two people had recognized something valuable in each other at a moment when the rest of the world saw only damaged goods. They had chosen to build something together rather than face their challenges alone. The dollar that Dutch had bid at that long-ago auction had purchased not just a month's labor, but a future neither of them could have imagined. It had bought hope, healing, and a love that would endure long after the last echoes of cruel laughter had faded into silence. And in the end, no one who knew their story ever laughed again at the idea that a single dollar, spent with wisdom and compassion, could change the world.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.